There wasn't a single whisper from the lock. Dino Mendel had oiled every hinge in the fortress himself the night before, moving through his own estate like a ghost haunting someone else's tomb, which was ironic because there wasn't a door in all of the exclusive Belmont Heights that he couldn't silence with a wire transfer or a well-placed threat. He'd been planning this ambush for 4 days, ever since Sila's, the 58-year-old estate manager who'd climbed the Mendel family ladder for 25 years, had leaned close to his shoulder that afternoon and whispered with the kind of calculated concern he'd mistaken for devotion. "That Mercy girl does peculiar things with your twins when you're away, boss. The children don't cry anymore, and that's unnatural. Bobbies are supposed to wail, and if they're not wailing, it's because she's drugging them or terrifying them into submission." Dino, who only saw his daughters in controlled appointments between international calls and territory disputes, hadn't realized that their silence in his presence was a ceasefire, not a symptom of sedation. Those words had been smoldering inside Dino's skull for 4 straight nights, like gasoline waiting for a match that refused to burn out. The paranoia of a widowed kingpin is the most lethal weapon in existence because it doesn't transform into caution. It transforms into an execution order before there's even a fingerprint of proof. And when that widowed kingpin also happens to be the most ruthless mafia boss controlling 3 states, the execution doesn't require a courtroom. So this morning he'd kissed his twin daughters goodbye, slid into the bulletproof sedan, instructed Silas to announce that he was flying to Vancouver for negotiations with a rival syndicate, then parked 7 blocks away and walked back through the fog with his leather briefcase in one hand. A briefcase that carried nothing but rage and the frozen weight of a verdict he'd already pronounced. Because before he'd abandoned the estate, he'd told Silas in a tone that permitted no hesitation, "If I discover she's poisoning them, I want her erased before sunrise. No witnesses." Dino turned the brass handle so deliberately that every heartbeat stretched into an eternity. Inside, the mansion drowned in the same deceptive stillness he'd grown dangerously accustomed to since Catalina's funeral. That suffocating hush he'd forced into every room with protocols, surveillance, and a mourning period that had bled past 18 months with no evidence of healing. Ever since the stray bullet meant for a federal prosecutor had shattered her windshield instead, and left him with 2 daughters he didn't know how to embrace without feeling like his arms were made of barbed wire. He dismissed 6 nannies in 9 months, 1 for arriving 4 minutes late, 1 for humming while changing diapers, 1 simply because her perfume reminded him too much of what he'd lost, 1 for placing Luna on her back without submitting a written care plan. And 1, the last one, because he'd discovered her recording video of his children on her personal device. And in his world, filming a boss's family without authorization was the kind of transgression people didn't survive to regret. But this Mercy Holloway was something else entirely. She was an equation he couldn't solve. Too young at 26, too unqualified, raised in group homes with no surname that mattered and no political leverage, and according to Silas, far too damaged, too common, too street trash beneath the Mendel dynasty. Dino stepped into the marble foyer and froze completely, holding his lungs hostage, listening against the vacuum. He expected screaming. He expected cartoon voices blasting from the entertainment system. He expected to find Mercy unconscious on the velvet sectional while his daughters lay forgotten in their nursery. But what drifted toward him from the living room wasn't anything he'd armored himself to confront. It wasn't screaming. It wasn't television static. It was laughter. Not the manufactured, careful kind, but the deep, body-shaking, oxygen-starved kind that explodes from somewhere so ancient and honest it almost sounds like sobbing. The kind of laughter that rattles foundations and fills souls and aches in the most beautiful way. Welcome to our channel. We're diving into a story where the dead still have a say in the living. Before we reveal the secret, rate this opening on a scale of 1 to 10 in the comments. Dino didn't move from the foyer. He stood there like a man who'd forgotten how his own legs worked, listening to that laughter ricochet off the vaulted ceilings, and for the first time in 18 months, he felt something other than the constant hum of rage that had replaced his pulse. It was confusion, maybe even curiosity, but confusion was a luxury he'd stopped allowing himself the day they'd lowered Catalina into the ground, and curiosity had gotten better men than him killed in his line of work. So he crushed both feelings like cigarettes under his heel and let the fury back in, because fury was familiar, and fury kept him breathing. He moved toward the living room with the practiced silence of a predator, each step calculated, each breath controlled. The laughter grew louder, joined now by smaller sounds, high-pitched squeals that could only belong to Luna and Arya, his daughters, the two pieces of Catalina he'd been given to protect and had no idea how to love. He pressed himself against the wall just outside the archway, listening, building his case like a prosecutor who'd already decided on the sentence. Again, again. That was Luna's voice, breathless and bright, a sound he'd heard maybe twice in her entire 2 years of life. All right, but this time you have to catch it. That was Mercy's voice, warm and unguarded, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd never learned that joy was dangerous. Dino risked a glance around the corner and felt his entire body go rigid. The Persian rug, the $12,000 antique Persian rug that Catalina had picked out 3 months before she died, the one he'd placed museum-grade protective pads beneath, was covered in yellow rubber gloves. Not just a few. Dozens of them, inflated like balloons, bouncing across the floor as Mercy batted them toward his daughters, who were sprawling on their stomachs, giggling so hard they could barely breathe, reaching out with chubby hands to grab the floating gloves. Luna, his Luna, who the doctors said would never walk without extensive surgery and years of physical therapy, was up on her knees, rocking back and forth, her face split wide with a smile so genuine it looked like it hurt. Arya was rolling across the rug, her legs kicking wildly, not a single tear on her face, just pure, unfiltered delight. Mercy was lying on her back in the center of the chaos, still wearing her maid's uniform, yellow gloves on both hands, making exaggerated swimming motions with her arms as she launched another inflated glove into the air. "Hurricane incoming!" she shouted, and both girls shrieked with anticipation. Dino felt his jaw clench so hard he tasted copper. This wasn't childcare. This was anarchy. This was everything Silas had warned him about, wrapped in laughter and rubber and complete disrespect for the order he'd built. He pulled back from the archway, his mind already writing the script. She's making a mockery of this house. She's teaching them that chaos is acceptable. She's erasing the discipline I've tried to instill. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see a text from Silas. "Did you find what I told you about? I can have the car ready in 10 minutes. Dino stared at the message, then at the scene in front of him, then back at the message. Silas had been right. The children weren't crying. They were laughing, which was somehow worse, because laughter meant attachment, and attachment to the wrong person was a weakness that could be exploited. In his world, weakness got you killed. Weakness got the people you loved killed. He thought back to 4 days ago, when this had all started. He'd been in his office, reviewing the quarterly reports, when Silas had knocked on the door with that expression he always wore, concerned but controlled, like a man delivering bad news he took no pleasure in. "We need to discuss the new girl," Silas had said, closing the door behind him. "I've been observing her interactions with the twins, and I'm seeing some troubling patterns." Dino had looked up from the spreadsheets, immediately alert. "What patterns?" "The children don't cry when she's around. Not once. I've been monitoring the nursery camera feeds, and in the 3 weeks she's been here, I haven't heard a single cry during her shifts." Silas had paused, letting that sink in. "Boss, Bobby's cry, it's neurological. It's how they communicate discomfort, hunger, fear. If they're not crying, it means something is suppressing that natural response." "You think she's drugging them?" It wasn't a question. "I think it's worth investigating. She has no credentials, no references we can verify, no family we can lean on for background. She appeared out of nowhere, and now your daughters are behaving in ways that defy normal child development. The silence isn't peace, boss. It's a symptom." Dino had believed him instantly, because Silas had never steered him wrong. Silas had been there when Catalina died, had helped him navigate the impossible logistics of running an empire while drowning in grief. Silas had fired the nannies who weren't good enough, had vetted the security updates, had kept the machine running when Dino could barely remember to eat. Silas was loyalty incarnated. Except now, standing in his own foyer, listening to his daughters laugh like they'd never known sorrow, Dino felt the first hairline crack in that certainty. Because this didn't sound like drugged children. This sounded like children who'd found something they'd been missing, and he couldn't identify what that something was, which made it dangerous. Another text from Silas. Remember what we discussed. Street trash always has an agenda. Don't let the performance fool you. Dino looked at the words, then back at the archway. Luna was trying to stand now, using Mercy's leg as leverage, her weak muscles trembling with effort, and instead of stopping her, instead of calling for the physical therapist or consulting the medical protocol, Mercy was just letting it happen, one hand steadying Luna's back, whispering encouragement Dino couldn't quite hear. He made his decision. He would fire her tonight before whatever she was doing could take deeper root, before his daughters started asking for her instead of him, before the laughter became a language he didn't speak. He turned away from the scene and walked back toward the foyer, already composing the speech in his head, already hardening himself against the pleading he knew would come. Silas was right. Kindness was always a scam when it came from people who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. If you've ever had someone try to gaslight you into hating a good person, hit like and subscribe to show Silas he can't win. Dino didn't leave. He told himself he would, that he'd seen enough to confirm Silas's suspicions, that the responsible thing was to end this now before it metastasized into something he couldn't control. But his feet stayed rooted to the marble floor, and his eyes kept drifting back to the archway, pulled by a gravity he didn't understand and didn't trust. He watched Mercy sit up, cross-legged on the Persian rug, and gently guide Luna back down to her stomach. "Okay, little warrior, we're going to try the reaching game again," she said, her voice dropping to that soft, steady tone people used with wild animals they were trying not to startle. She held up one of the yellow rubber gloves, inflated and tied at the wrist, and placed it just beyond Luna's fingertips. "Can you get it? Can you reach the sunshine glove?" Luna's face scrunched with concentration, her small body trembling as she extended her right arm, her fingers splaying wide, stretching for the impossible. Dino felt his chest tighten. He'd seen this before, in the sterile physical therapy room at the hospital, with the specialist who charged $800 an hour to move Luna's legs through prescribed motions while she screamed. The doctor had said it would take years, maybe never, that the nerve damage from the complicated birth was too severe, that Dino needed to prepare himself for a daughter who would need assistance for life. But here, now, on his dead wife's rug, Luna was reaching. Not because someone was forcing her limbs through the motions, but because she wanted the glove, because Mercy had made her want it. That's it, you're almost there." Mercy inched the glove forward just enough that Luna's fingers brushed it, and when they did, Mercy erupted in celebration like Luna had just won an Olympic medal. "You did it! You touched the sunshine! You're so strong!" Arya, not wanting to be left out, crawled over and grabbed a different glove, waving it in the air like a victory flag, and Mercy scooped her up with one arm, spinning her in a circle while Arya shrieked with delight. Then she set Arya down and immediately returned to Luna, placing another glove, this time slightly farther away. "Ready for level 2. Dino's hands curled into fists. This wasn't therapy. Therapy was clinical, measured, documented in charts and progress reports. This was chaos masquerading as care, and chaos was exactly what Silas had warned him about. Look at the rug, he thought. Look at what she's done to Catalina's rug. The gloves were everywhere, some deflated, some still inflated, scattered across the intricate patterns like yellow wounds. There would be rubber residue on the fabric. There would be stretching from the girls crawling on it. This was a $12,000 piece of art, and Mercy was treating it like a playground mat. But even as his anger built its case, another part of him, the part he'd been suffocating since the funeral, whispered a different truth. Catalina had bought that rug for moments exactly like this. She'd spent 3 hours in the antique shop, running her hands over different textures, explaining to him that she wanted something soft enough for Bobbies to play on, beautiful enough to make the house feel like a home. "I don't want our children growing up in a museum," she'd said. "I want them growing up in a place where they're allowed to make messes and memories." He'd forgotten that, or maybe he'd deliberately erased it, because remembering what Catalina wanted meant admitting how completely he'd failed to give it to her daughters. Mercy positioned 3 gloves in a triangle formation around Luna, each one requiring a different reaching angle. "All right, champion, which color do you want first? Yellow, yellow, or yellow?" She grinned, and Luna actually laughed, a sound like bells that Dino realized he'd never heard before, not once in 2 years. Luna reached for the closest glove, and this time, instead of just touching it, she grabbed it, her weak fingers somehow finding the strength to clutch the rubber, and when she pulled it toward her chest, Mercy didn't just celebrate. She dropped down to Luna's eye level and pressed her forehead gently against Luna's. "You are a miracle," she whispered, loud enough for Dino to hear from his hiding place. "Do you know that? You're a walking, talking, reaching miracle." Except Luna wasn't walking. Luna couldn't walk. That was the entire problem, the diagnosis that had been handed down like a life sentence, the reality that Dino had accepted because doctors didn't lie about things like nerve damage and motor function. But then Mercy did something that made Dino's blood go cold. She stood up, walked across the room to the leather sofa, and sat down, leaving both gloves and both girls on the rug. "I'm going to rest for a minute," she announced, making a show of stretching her arms over her head. "I'm so tired from all that playing." Luna's face immediately crumpled. She looked at Mercy, then at the gloves, then back at Mercy, and Dino could see the decision forming behind his daughter's eyes. She wanted to follow Mercy. She wanted to close the distance, and the gloves weren't going to get her there. Luna placed both palms flat on the rug. She pulled her knees under her torso, wobbling, unstable, her whole body shaking with effort that looked painful to watch. Dino wanted to rush in, to stop this, to prevent whatever injury was about to happen, but something kept him frozen. "You can do it, baby," Mercy said from the sofa, her voice encouraging but not demanding, offering permission instead of pressure. "Come see me, I'm right here." Luna lifted one knee, then the other. She was on all fours now, swaying like a building in an earthquake, and Arya had stopped playing to watch, her tiny face serious and focused. Luna moved one hand forward, then one knee. She was crawling. Poorly, shakily, like a newborn deer on ice, but she was crawling toward Mercy, propelled by nothing but desire. When she reached the sofa, Mercy slid down to the floor and caught her, wrapping Luna in an embrace so tight it looked like she was trying to transfer her own strength directly into the child's bones. "I knew you could do it," Mercy whispered into Luna's hair. "I knew it the first time I met you. You're stronger than anyone knows." Dino stumbled backward from the archway, his breathing ragged, his vision blurring at the edges. He just watched his disabled daughter crawl across a room because a stranger with yellow rubber gloves had made her believe she could. He'd watched a miracle happen on a Tuesday afternoon in his own living room, and instead of gratitude, all he felt was rage. Because if Mercy could do this in 3 weeks, what did that say about the 18 months he'd spent building walls instead of bridges? What did that say about every specialist he'd hired who told him to lower his expectations? What did that say about the father he'd become? He pulled out his phone and typed a message to Silas. "I'm coming back in tonight. Have the termination paperwork ready." Dino waited until 8 p.m., after the twins were asleep, after the house had returned to the suffocating silence he'd mistaken for order. He'd spent the hours in between rehearsing his justifications, building an ironclad case against a woman whose only crime was making his daughters laugh. Silas had prepared the severance package, 3 months' pay, more than generous for someone who'd worked less than a month, the kind of money that was meant to buy silence and erase guilt. He found Mercy in the kitchen, wiping down the marble countertops with the same yellow rubber gloves she'd used for the miracle on the rug. She looked up when he entered, and her face broke into a smile that made him want to put his fist through the wall. "Mr. Mendel, I thought you were in Vancouver until Thursday. Did the meeting end early?" He didn't answer. He pulled out one of the bar stools and sat down, positioning himself between her and the exit, a habit from years of making sure conversations ended on his terms. "We need to talk about your employment." The smile faltered. She set down the cloth, peeled off the gloves, and folded her hands in front of her like a student called to the principal's office. "Did I do something wrong?" "That depends on your definition of wrong." He kept his voice flat, emotionless, the same tone he used when delivering verdicts to men who'd betrayed the family. "I came home early today. I saw what you were doing with my daughters." She blinked, confused. "The reaching exercises? I know I should have asked permission first, but Luna's been making such incredible progress, and I read this article about neuroplasticity in toddlers, and I thought." "You thought you could turn my living room into a circus?" He leaned forward, letting the words land like stones. "You thought you could disrespect a $12,000 Persian rug, ignore every protocol I've established, and conduct unauthorized therapy sessions on a child with documented medical limitations." "Mr. Mendel, Luna crawled today. For the first time, she has a team of specialists who are trained to handle her condition. You are not trained. You are not qualified. You are a maid who has overstepped her position so dramatically that I'm questioning the judgment of whoever hired you in the first place." That landed. He saw it in the way her shoulders dropped, in the way her eyes went bright with tears she was trying to swallow. Good. Emotion was leverage. Emotion meant she'd take the money and disappear without asking questions. "I was just trying to help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The girls seemed so sad when I first got here. They didn't play. They didn't laugh. They just sat in their cribs and stared at the ceiling, and I thought." "You thought wrong." He stood up, pulling the severance envelope from his jacket pocket and placing it on the counter between them. "Your employment is terminated effective immediately. Inside is 3 months' salary, which is more than fair considering you've been here less than 4 weeks. You'll gather your belongings and vacate the premises within the hour." She stared at the envelope like it was a snake. "You're firing me because I made your daughters happy." "I'm firing you because you don't understand boundaries, because you think kindness gives you permission to ignore authority, because in my world, people who operate outside established rules are liabilities, and I don't keep liabilities in my home." He checked his watch, a gesture meant to communicate that this conversation had a deadline. "You have until 9 p.m. to be gone. After that, minute 11 won't be pleasant." She flinched at that, and he felt a sick satisfaction in watching her realize that this wasn't a negotiation. "What happens at minute 11? Security removes you, and when security gets involved in my house, they don't operate with the same restraint I'm showing you right now. Take the money, Mercy. Leave quietly. Consider yourself lucky I'm letting you walk out instead of dragging you out." For a long moment, she just looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that he couldn't identify. Not fear, not anger. Something deeper, something that looked almost like pity, which enraged him more than defiance would have. "Can I at least say goodbye to them?" "No." "Mr. Mendel." "The answer is no. You will not confuse my daughters with a dramatic farewell. You will not plant ideas in their heads about where you're going or why. You will disappear from their lives as quickly as you entered, and by tomorrow morning, they won't even remember you existed." That was a lie, and they both knew it. He'd seen the way Luna had crawled toward her, the way Arya's whole face lit up when Mercy entered the room. His daughters would remember. They would ask for her. They would cry for her, the same way they'd cried for Catalina in those first terrible months after the funeral. Mercy picked up the envelope with shaking hands. She didn't open it, didn't count the money, just held it against her chest like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "I have something I need to tell you first." "I don't want to hear it." "It's about your wife." The room went absolutely still. Dino felt every muscle in his body lock into place, felt the rage that had been simmering all day finally boil over into something volcanic. "You will not speak about my wife. You don't have the right to even think her name." "She donated her organs." Mercy's voice was steady now, despite the tears running down her face. "The night she died, she was registered as a donor, and they harvested her heart, her kidneys, her liver. The heart went to a 24-year-old woman who'd been on the transplant list for 2 years. That woman was me." Dino's world tilted sideways. He gripped the edge of the counter to keep himself upright, his mind trying to process words that didn't make sense. That couldn't possibly be true. "You're lying." "I have the medical records. I have the scar. I have the anti-rejection medication I take every morning at 6 a.m. that keeps your wife's heart beating inside my chest." She pulled down the collar of her uniform, revealing the top edge of a vertical scar that disappeared beneath the fabric. That's why the girls react to me the way they do. That's why they stopped crying. They recognize the heartbeat. They recognize their mother. He wanted to call her a liar again. He wanted to throw her out immediately, to have Silas verify that this was an elaborate con, a manipulation designed to secure her position in a wealthy household. But something in his own chest was responding to her words, something visceral and immediate that felt like recognition. "Get out," he heard himself say. "Take the money and get out. If I see you near my daughters again, medical miracle or not, minute 11 will come early." She left without another word, still holding the envelope, still crying. The kitchen door closed behind her with a click that sounded like a gunshot, and Dino stood alone in the silence, staring at the spot where she'd revealed the scar, wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. The screaming started at 4:17 a.m., and it didn't stop. Dino had been awake anyway, staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, trying not to think about the look on Mercy's face when Silas had walked her to the gate with her single duffel bag. He'd told himself it was done, that he'd eliminated a threat, that by morning the house would return to the controlled silence he'd worked so hard to maintain. But the universe had a way of punishing certainty, and at 4:17 a.m., it sent that punishment in the form of his daughter's voices, raw and desperate and utterly inconsolable. He threw off the covers and moved down the hallway, his heart pounding with something that felt uncomfortably close to panic. The nursery door was already open, and inside he found both Luna and Arya standing in their cribs, faces red and soaked with tears, screaming a single word over and over. "Messy, messy, messy." Dino approached Luna's crib first, reaching down to pick her up, but she recoiled from his hands like he was made of fire. She pressed herself against the corner of the crib, one small hand clutching at her chest, right over her heart, her eyes wild and searching. "Messy," she wailed, and the sound was so broken it didn't seem possible it could come from something so small. "I'm here," Dino said, his voice cracking despite his best efforts. "Daddy's here, it's okay." But it wasn't okay, because he wasn't who they wanted, and they knew it. Arya was doing the same thing. One fist pressed against her own chest, her whole body shaking with the force of her crying. They were mirroring each other, identical in their grief, and Dino realized with growing horror that this wasn't ordinary crying. This was mourning. He managed to lift Luna out of her crib despite her resistance, holding her against his chest, trying to transfer some kind of comfort through proximity alone. But she just kept crying, kept pushing against him, kept reaching toward the door with one hand while the other remained pressed over her heart. "Messy, messy." "She's gone," Dino heard himself say, and the words felt like confessing to murder. "She had to go, but I'm here, I'm your father, and I'm here." Luna looked up at him with Catalina's eyes, and Dino saw something in them that made his blood run cold. It wasn't just sadness. It wasn't just confusion. It was recognition of betrayal. His 2-year-old daughter was looking at him like he'd stolen something irreplaceable, and she was right. He spent the next 2 hours trying everything. He heated bottles. He sang songs he barely remembered the words to. He turned on the television, brought out toys, walked them around the house, tried to recreate the chaos of yellow gloves and laughter. Nothing worked. The crying would quiet for moments, brief pauses where they seemed to be listening for something, and then it would start again, worse than before, like they'd confirmed that what they were listening for wasn't coming back. At 6:33 a.m., something changed. Luna stopped crying mid-wail, her whole body going rigid in Dino's arms. She pressed both hands against her chest now, her eyes closing, her breathing evening out like she was concentrating on something only she could hear. Arya did the same thing in her crib, both hands over her heart, her tear-streaked face suddenly peaceful. Dino felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. This wasn't normal. This was something else, something he didn't have a framework to understand. He watched his daughters synchronize their breathing, watched them tilt their heads slightly to the left like they were tracking a sound he couldn't perceive. Then Luna's eyes opened, and she looked directly at the front door. Not toward it, at it, with purpose and certainty. She pulled against Dino's grip, her weak legs suddenly finding strength he didn't know she possessed, and she whispered one word, "Coming." "What?" Dino's voice came out strangled. "What did you say?" But Luna wasn't talking to him. She was talking to Arya, who had pulled herself to standing in her crib and was also staring at the front door with the same eerie focus. "Coming," Arya repeated, like they were sharing a conversation Dino wasn't invited to. He carried Luna toward the door, driven by something between curiosity and dread, and when they reached the foyer, Luna started reaching for the handle, her whole body straining toward it. Dino shifted her to one hip and opened the door, expecting nothing, expecting to prove to his daughters that their hope was misplaced. The driveway was empty. The street was empty. Dawn was just starting to break over Belmont Heights, painting everything in shades of gray and gold, and there was no one there. Luna's face crumpled again, her hands returning to her chest, and she looked up at Dino with such profound devastation that he felt something crack inside his own chest. "She's not coming back," he said softly, and he didn't know if he was talking to Luna or to himself. "I made sure of that." But Luna shook her head, adamant even through her tears. She patted her own chest, then pointed at the empty driveway, then back at her chest again. The message was clear even if Dino didn't understand the mechanism. She could feel something. Something that lived in her chest, something that told her Mercy was supposed to be there, something that he couldn't hear or sense or access. He carried both girls back inside and called the pediatrician, who arrived at 8:15 a.m. and spent an hour examining them, checking for signs of withdrawal, for evidence of chemical dependency, for anything that would explain this level of distress. "There's nothing wrong with them physically," Dr. Ashford said, closing her medical bag. "But Mr. Mendel, I need to ask you a difficult question. What changed in their environment in the last 24 hours? "I fired their nanny," Dino admitted, the words tasting like ash. "When?" "Last night." Dr. Ashford looked at the twins, who had finally exhausted themselves into a fitful sleep, still occasionally whimpering in their cribs. Children this age form profound attachments to their primary caregivers. If this nanny was providing consistent, nurturing care. 3 weeks, Dino interrupted. She was only here 3 weeks. 3 weeks of constant contact with an infant is a lifetime in their developmental timeline, Dr. Ashford said. "Mr. Mendel, I don't know what your reasons were for letting her go, but from a medical standpoint, you've just severed a bond that these children were depending on. This grief you're seeing, it's real, it's profound, and it's not going to resolve quickly." After she left, Dino stood in the nursery, watching his daughters sleep, watching their small hands occasionally drift to their chests like they were checking for something that should be there, but wasn't. He thought about what Mercy had said, "You're never there to see anything." She was right. He hadn't seen Luna's first crawl. He hadn't heard their laughter until he'd spied on them like an intruder in his own home. He'd been so busy building walls to protect them that he'd forgotten they needed windows to grow. His phone buzzed. A text from Sela's. "New nanny interviews scheduled for tomorrow. I'll make sure we find someone appropriate this time." Dino stared at the message, then at his daughters, then back at the message. They weren't listening for a new nanny. They were listening for Mercy specifically, their hands over their hearts, tracking something he couldn't perceive. And for the first time since Catalina's death, Dino wondered if there were some things that couldn't be controlled, some bonds that defied his understanding of how the world worked. Some truths that lived in the space between heartbeats. The twins didn't eat for 3 days. They would take a few sips of milk, then push the bottles away, their hands returning to their chests like they were checking for a pulse that didn't match their own. Dino tried everything the pediatrician suggested, different formulas, different temperatures, different feeding positions, but nothing worked. They were wasting away in front of him, and he was powerless to stop it. On the 4th day, at 2:47 a.m., he gave up on sleep entirely and went to his office. If he couldn't fix his daughters, he could at least understand what he was dealing with. He needed to know what Mercy had done to create this level of attachment in 3 weeks, what psychological manipulation she'd employed, what leverage she still held over his children even in her absence. He started with the basics. background check, financial records, social media footprints, but Mercy Holloway was a ghost. No Facebook, no Instagram, no digital trail beyond a checking account with $1,700 and a rental agreement for a studio apartment in the cheapest part of the city. No family listed on any forms, no emergency contacts, no past employers willing to go on record. The only substantial document in her file was a medical history form she'd filled out during the hearing process, and Dino had barely glanced at it before because Silas had assured him the health screening was clean. But now, at 3 a.m, with his daughters starving themselves in the next room, he pulled up the scanned copy and read it line by line. Most of it was standard. No allergies, no chronic conditions, no medications. But there, in the section marked major surgeries or hospitalizations, she'd written in careful handwriting, heart transplant, February 2024. Dino's vision tunneled. He read the line again, then again, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. February 2024. Catalina had died in February 2024. Specifically, February 14th, Valentine's Day, a piece of irony so cruel that Dino had stopped believing in any kind of benevolent universe. He opened a new browser window and navigated to the National Organ Transplant Database, a system he'd hacked access to years ago when he needed leverage on a rival's family member. The security was better now, but not good enough to keep out someone with his resources and his motivation. It took him 47 minutes to bypass the authentication protocols and access the recipient records. He searched for Mercy's name, birth date, and blood type. The record loaded, and Dino felt the floor drop out from under him. Recipient, Mercy Holloway, 26 years old, type AB negative. Transplant date, February 14. 2024, 11:43 p.m. Donor, anonymous female, age 28, cause of death, gunshot wound to chest, catastrophic cardiac trauma. Dino's hands started shaking. He pulled up Catalina's death certificate, even though he had it memorized, even though he'd read it so many times the words had burned into his brain. Time of death, 10:17 p.m. Cause, gunshot wound to chest during attempted carjacking. He cross-referenced the donor code from Mercy's file with the donor database, and there it was, the connection he'd been too blind to see, donor 2847C Catalina Mendel. Organ procurement, heart, kidneys, liver, corneas. Heart recipient, Mercy Holloway. The woman he'd fired, the woman his daughters were mourning like a death, was walking around with Catalina's heart beating in her chest. Dino stood up so fast his chair toppled backward. He paced the office, his mind racing through implications and impossibilities. The twins' hands on their chests, their certainty that Mercy was coming. The way they'd synchronized their breathing like they were listening to a rhythm only they could hear. Luna's first crawl, propelled by a desire to reach someone she'd known for 3 weeks, but somehow recognized on a level deeper than memory. They weren't attached to Mercy. They were attached to the heartbeat they'd heard in the womb, the rhythm that had lulled them to sleep for 9 months, the sound of their mother's love translated into steady percussion. His phone rang, and he grabbed it without checking the caller ID. What? Boss, it's Silas. I'm sorry to call so late, but I wanted to give you an update on the nanny situation. I found 3 excellent candidates. You knew, Dino said, his voice flat and lethal. A pause. Knew what, boss? About the transplant. About Mercy having Catalina's heart. You knew, and you used it to make me fire her. The silence on the other end of the line stretched too long. When Silas finally spoke, his voice had lost its deferential tone. I did what was necessary to protect this family from a stalker. That girl showed up here knowing exactly whose heart she had, knowing she could manipulate your daughters with some kind of biological connection, knowing she could worm her way into your life by playing on your grief. She never mentioned it, Dino said. Not once. Because she's smart. She let the children do the work for her, let you discover it on your own, so it would feel like fate instead of calculation. Boss, think about it. What are the odds that the woman who received your wife's heart just happens to apply for a job in your home? That's not coincidence. That's premeditation. Dino thought about Mercy in the kitchen, washing dishes she wasn't paid to wash. Mercy on the floor with yellow gloves, creating miracles out of rubber and laughter. Mercy's face when he'd fired her, the hurt in her eyes when he'd said his daughters would forget her in a week. "You've been embezzling," Dino said quietly. "I checked the accounts 3 months ago, $200,000 missing from the discretionary fund. I was going to ask you about it, but then Catalina died and I forgot. But you didn't forget. You needed me distracted, needed me focused on anything except the money you were stealing." "Boss." Mercy wasn't the threat. You were. You saw her medical file, saw the connection, and you used my grief as a weapon to get rid of the one person who might have made me whole enough to notice what you were doing. "I have served this family for 25 years, Silas said, and there was real anger in his voice now. "I have bled for this family. I have killed for this family. And you're going to throw that away for some street girl who got lucky with an organ transplant?" "Get out of my house," Dino said. "You have 1 hour to clear out your office. If you're still here when I come downstairs, I'll handle this the way I used to handle betrayal." He hung up before Silas could respond and pulled up Mercy's rental agreement, memorizing the address. The sun was starting to rise, painting the office in shades of gold that reminded him of Catalina's hair, and somewhere in the mansion, his daughters were sleeping fitfully, their hands still pressed to their chests, still listening for the heartbeat that should have been lost forever but somehow, impossibly, still lived. Dino had spent 18 months trying to bury his wife, but Catalina had never stopped fighting to come home. Are you siding with the man who sees only money, or the girl who carries a miracle? Comment, the heart remembers if you're with Mercy. Dino should have gone straight to Mercy's apartment. Every instinct that hadn't been corrupted by grief and paranoia was screaming at him to find her, to bring her back, to fix what he'd broken. But 18 months of operating like a machine instead of a man had taught him that emotion without information was suicide, and there was one more thing he needed to confirm before he could allow himself to hope. He pulled up the security footage from the day Catalina died. He'd watched it once in the hospital while the doctors were still trying to save her. He'd watched the black SUV pull alongside her car at the intersection, watched the window roll down, watched the muzzle flash that had ended everything. The police had called it a random carjacking, gang violence spilling into the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. They'd never found the shooter. The case had gone cold within 6 weeks. But Dino had never believed in coincidence, and now, with Silas's betrayal confirmed, he watched the footage again with different eyes. He slowed it down, frame by frame, zooming in on details he'd been too destroyed to notice the first time. The SUV's license plate was obscured, but there was a parking permit sticker on the windshield, partially visible. He enhanced the image, ran it through his database, and felt his stomach drop. It was a permit for the Volkov Industrial Complex, the Russian syndicate that had been trying to move into his territory for the past 3 years. The Volkovs didn't do random hits. They did calculated eliminations, and they only moved when they had inside information. Dino opened his financial software and started pulling thread. The embezzlement from Silas wasn't just theft. It was systematic, strategic, designed to weaken the family's liquidity right when they'd need it most for a territorial war. He traced the money through shell companies and offshore accounts, following the digital breadcrumbs until he found what he was looking for. 3 wire transfers from Silas's hidden account to a Volkov front company, each one dated within a week of major family movements. Silas hadn't just been stealing money, he'd been selling intelligence. Dino's hands curled into fists. He pulled up his communication logs, searching for any mention of Catalina's schedule on the day she died. There, in an email from Silas to the security team, Mrs. Mendel will be taking the twins to the pediatrician at 3:00 p.m. Route and timing attached for coordination. That email had been sent at 10:47 a.m. By 2:30 p.m., Catalina was in her car alone because the twins had both come down with fevers and she'd decided to reschedule. She'd called Dino to tell him, and he'd been in a meeting with Silas, reviewing quarterly projections. He'd put her on speaker for 30 seconds, told her he loved her, told her he'd see her at dinner. Silas had been in the room. Silas had heard the change of plans. Dino pulled up Silas's phone records from that day, and there it was. A 2-minute call to an unlisted number at 2:37 p.m., 7 minutes after Catalina had called. He ran the number through every database he had access to, and it came back connected to Dmitry Volkov's personal security detail. The hit wasn't random. It was a message. The Volkovs had been trying to start a war, and Silas had handed them the match. But the worst part, the piece that made Dino's vision go red, was what came next. He pulled up Silas's recent communications, the ones from the past 3 weeks, and found a thread that made everything click into place. Silas had been coordinating with the Volkovs again. Encrypted messages, careful language, but the intent was clear. They were planning something big, something that required detailed information about the mansion's security protocols, the twins' daily routines, Dino's travel schedule. And in the middle of those messages was a single line that stopped Dino's heart. The transplant girl is a problem. She's creating attachment. If the children bond too deeply, Mendel won't leave them even for necessary meetings. Recommend immediate removal. The Volkovs had responded. Can you engineer it to look like Mendel's decision? Silas, already in motion. He trusts my judgment on household staff. She'll be gone by end of week. The timestamps matched. Silas had started planting seeds about Mercy being dangerous 4 days before his concerned warning about the children not crying. He'd manufactured the entire crisis, knowing exactly which buttons to push, knowing Dino's grief had made him paranoid enough to see threats where there was only salvation. Mercy hadn't been trying to manipulate the children. She'd been protecting them, using the only gift Catalina had left behind, her heart, to keep the twins safe while Silas was systematically dismantling every defense Dino had built. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Get rid of Mercy, isolate the children, create chaos in the household. Then, when Dino was at his weakest, when he was drowning in another loss he couldn't control, the Volkovs would strike. Not at Dino directly, but at the twins. A kidnapping, maybe, or worse. Something that would break him completely, leave the territory vulnerable, allow them to move in without resistance. Silas had been betting on Dino's rage. Betting that a grieving father would choose control over connection, that he'd fire the one person who could truly protect his children, because she represented everything he couldn't understand. And Dino had proven him right. He pulled up the current security feed and saw Silas in his office, methodically shredding documents, erasing evidence. The man had 1 hour, and he was using it to cover his tracks, probably assuming Dino would cool down, would realize he needed Silas's institutional knowledge, would choose pragmatism over justice like he always had. But Dino wasn't the same man who'd built this empire on pragmatism and fear. That man had died the moment he'd watched Luna press her hand to her chest and listen for a heartbeat that shouldn't exist but did. He picked up his phone and made 3 calls. The first was to his head of security, with instructions to lock down the mansion and detain Silas. The second was to his lawyer, with instructions to begin transferring Silas's embezzled funds back into the family accounts, and to prepare criminal charges that would put him away for the rest of his life. The third was to Dmitry Volkov's personal line, a number he'd sworn he'd never use except in the event of all-out war. When Dmitry answered, his voice was smooth and unconcerned. Dino Mendel, to what do I owe the pleasure? I know about the coordinates, Dino said quietly. I know about Catalina. I know about your plans for my daughters, and I want you to know that I'm not going to kill you. A pause. No. No, because killing you would be quick, and you don't deserve quick. I'm going to dismantle everything you've built, piece by piece, until you're begging me for the mercy of a bullet. And when you're broken and desperate and completely alone, I'm going to walk away and let you live with what you've lost. He hung up before Dmitry could respond and walked out of his office, leaving behind the man he'd been, the one who solved problems with violence and intimidation, and stepped into the version of himself that Catalina had always believed existed beneath the armor. The version that understood some things were worth more than territory or power or revenge. Some things were worth burning down an empire to protect. The address led him to a building that should have been condemned. Dino stood outside the 5-story walk-up at 7:23 a.m., staring at the crumbling brick facade, the broken windows patched with cardboard, the front door hanging crooked on its hinges. This was where Mercy lived. This was where the woman carrying his wife's heart had been sleeping, while he'd been firing nannies for arriving 3 minutes late. He climbed the stairs, each step creaking under his weight, the smell of mold and decades-old cooking grease thick enough to taste. 3rd floor, apartment 3C, he could hear water dripping before he even reached her door, a steady percussion that suggested the leak wasn't minor. He knocked, once, twice, 3 times, no answer. "Mercy," he called out, his voice echoing in the hallway. "I know you're in there. I need to talk to you." Silence, then so quietly he almost missed it. "Go away." "I can't do that." "You fired me, Mr. Mendel. You made it very clear I wasn't wanted. So please just leave me alone." Dino pressed his forehead against the door, this barrier between himself and the only person who could save his daughters, and felt the weight of every mistake he'd made in the past 18 months crushing down on his shoulders. "The twins aren't eating," he said, and his voice cracked despite his best efforts to control it. "They haven't eaten properly in 4 days. They keep putting their hands over their hearts and listening for something I can't hear. Luna tried to walk yesterday." She made it 3 steps toward the front door before she collapsed, and when I picked her up, she looked at me like I'd betrayed her, which I did. I betrayed both of them when I fired you. The door opened so suddenly Dino almost fell forward. Mercy stood there in sweatpants and an oversized t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Behind her, he could see the studio apartment, a single room with a kitchenette, a bathroom visible through a doorway, and a bucket in the center of the floor catching water that dripped steadily from a brown stain on the ceiling. "They're not eating." Her voice was pure panic. 4 days. Dino, they're Bobbies. They can't go 4 days without." "I know," he interrupted. "Dr. Ashford has been coming twice a day. She's talked about feeding tubes if they don't start taking bottles by tomorrow." Mercy's hand went to her chest, pressing against the fabric of her shirt, and Dino watched her face transform. "I can feel it," she whispered. "When you said they were listening for something, I can feel them. It's like there's a string pulling tight right here." She pressed harder against her sternum. "I thought I was going crazy. I thought it was grief or guilt or just wishful thinking, but I can feel them, Dino. I've been feeling them since the first day I met them." Dino stepped into the apartment, uninvited, and closed the door behind him. The space was barely larger than his walk-in closet, and everything Mercy owned seemed to fit in 2 duffel bags stacked against the wall. There was a sleeping bag on the floor, a hot plate on the counter, and nothing else except the bucket catching water that should have been fixed months ago. "How long have you known?" he asked. "About the transplant, about Catalina." Mercy's eyes widened. "You know." "I hacked the database at 3 this morning. Catalina died at 10:17 p.m. on February 14th. You received her heart at 11:43 p.m. the same night." He took a step closer. "How long have you known?" "Since before I applied for the job," Mercy admitted, and Dino felt his anger flare before she continued. "But not the way you think. I didn't know who the donor was until after the surgery. They don't tell you. It's anonymous. But I was dying, Mr. Mendel. I had 6 weeks to live, maybe less, and then I got the call that they'd found a match. The doctors told me the donor was a young woman, a mother of twins, and that her heart was perfect." She sat down on the edge of the sleeping bag, her hands still pressed to her chest. "I spent 3 months recovering, learning to live with someone else's heartbeat, and then one day I was in a coffee shop and I saw your picture in the newspaper. There was an article about a charity donation, and the caption said, 'Widowed Mafia boss Dino Mendel honors late wife's memory.' The article mentioned that Catalina had died in February, that she'd left behind twin daughters, and I just knew. I felt it here." She tapped her chest. "So I looked up the date of her death, cross-referenced it with my surgery, and the timeline matched perfectly." "And you decided to infiltrate my home," Dino said, "but there was no heat in it anymore." "I decided to meet the children whose mother gave me a second chance at life," Mercy corrected. "I didn't have a plan beyond that. I didn't know if they'd even respond to me. But the first time I walked into that nursery and Luna looked at me, her whole face lit up like she recognized me. And Arya reached out her hands, and I swear to God, Dino, when I picked her up and held her against my chest, she stopped crying immediately. Not because I was special, because she could hear her mother. Dino's knees buckled. He sank down onto the floor beside Mercy, this woman who was a stranger and a ghost and a miracle all at once, and buried his face in his hands. I thought you were manipulating them. Silas said you were drugging them, and I believed him because it was easier than believing in something I couldn't control. Silas knew, Mercy said quietly. He came to my apartment 2 weeks ago. He told me he'd run a background check and discovered the transplant. He said if I ever told you the truth, he'd make sure I disappeared. He said you'd think I was a stalker, that you'd destroy me, and that the twins would be better off never knowing their mother's heart was still beating. He was selling information to the people who killed her, Dino said. He was setting up another attack, and you were the only thing standing in his way. The twins' attachment to you meant I couldn't be manipulated as easily. Mercy's eyes filled with tears. Are they safe? They're safe. Silas is being dealt with. The threat is neutralized. He looked up at her, at this young woman living in squalor while carrying the most precious thing he'd ever lost. But they're not okay. They won't be okay until you come back. You fired me, Mercy whispered. I was wrong. The words felt like pulling bullets out of his own chest. I was so wrong about everything. About you, about what my daughters needed, about what Catalina would have wanted. I've spent 18 months building a fortress when what they needed was a home. He reached out slowly, telegraphing his intention, and Mercy didn't pull away. He placed his hand over her chest, right where her heart, Catalina's heart, was beating steady and strong. The rhythm was exactly as he remembered it, that slightly faster tempo that used to lull him to sleep when he'd rest his head on her chest after making love. She's still here, he said, and his voice broke completely. All this time I thought I'd lost her, but she's been here, trying to come back to us, and I was too blind to see it. Mercy covered his hand with hers. I'm not her, Dino. I'm not Catalina. I don't want you to think. I know you're not her, he interrupted. But you're carrying a piece of her that my daughters recognize on a cellular level. And maybe that's not science. Maybe that's not logical. But I watched Luna crawl toward you because she wanted to, not because some doctor told her it was impossible. I watched my daughters laugh for the first time in their lives because you made them feel safe enough to be joyful. And I'm begging you to come back. What about the $12,000 rug? Mercy asked, and despite everything, there was the ghost of a smile on her face. Burn it, Dino said. Fill the whole house with yellow gloves and laughter and chaos. Turn it into exactly what Catalina wanted it to be. Just please come back. Mercy looked around her apartment, at the leaking ceiling and the bucket and the sleeping bag on the floor, then back at Dino. I need you to understand something. I didn't come to your home to replace her. I came because I wanted to give back a fraction of what she gave me. I wanted her daughters to know that their mother's sacrifice meant something. It meant everything, Dino said. It saved 4 lives, yours, Luna's, Arya's, and mine. He stood up and held out his hand. Come home, Mercy. Let me listen to my wife's heartbeat one more time. Let my daughters hear their mother's love. Let us become the family Catalina died trying to protect. Mercy took his hand, and Dino helped her to her feet. She grabbed one duffel bag, leaving everything else behind, and together they walked out of the apartment where she'd been hiding and into the rain that had started falling, washing away the past and making space for something new. Something that lived between heartbeats and defied every rule Dino had ever known. Something that proved love was stronger than death. The drive back to the mansion was silent except for the rain hammering against the windshield and Mercy's heartbeat, which Dino swore he could hear even over the storm. She sat in the passenger seat with both hands pressed to her chest, her eyes closed, and he knew she was doing exactly what his daughters had been doing for 4 days, listening, reaching out across an impossible distance, trying to transmit a message that defied everything science said was possible. They know you're coming, Dino said, and Mercy opened her eyes. How can you tell? Because I know what it looks like when someone is listening for hope. He turned onto the highway, heading toward Belmont Heights. I spent 18 months refusing to do it myself. His phone rang through the car's speakers. He glanced at the screen and saw a name that made his jaw tighten: John Carlo Benedetti. The only man in the eastern seaboard with more power than Dino, the closest thing the families had to a king, and someone who hadn't spoken to Dino since Catalina's funeral. He answered, "Carlo, I heard you had some trouble with the Volkovs." Carlo's voice came through, rough and aged like expensive whiskey. "I also heard you handled it without spilling a single drop of blood. That's not the Dino Mendel I know." "People change," Dino said carefully. "People don't change, son. They just finally become who they were supposed to be all along." A pause. "Catalina would be proud of what you did, choosing strategy over slaughter. That takes more strength than most men have." Dino's throat tightened. "I didn't do it for strategy. I did it because violence is what got her killed in the first place. If I keep solving problems the same way, I'm just creating more targets for people like the Volkovs to aim at." "Smart, which is why I'm calling to tell you that you now have a favor owed. The Benedetti favor, no expiration, no limitations. You helped my nephew 3 years ago when the feds were circling, and I don't forget debts. So whatever you need to finish this war the right way, you have my full support." Dino looked at Mercy, at this young woman who'd been living in squalor while carrying the heart of a queen, and he made a decision that would have been impossible 18 months ago. "I need you to help me bankrupt the Volkovs without firing a single shot." Carlo laughed, the sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "You want to bore them to death instead of bleeding them? I like it. Tell me what you need." Dino spent the next 15 minutes outlining the plan while Mercy listened, her eyes growing wider as she understood the scope of what he was proposing. It wasn't a war in the traditional sense. It was a systematic dismantling of everything the Volkovs had built, executed through financial pressure, political leverage, and strategic alliances. First, Carlo would use his connections in the banking sector to freeze the Volkovs' credit lines. No access to capital meant no ability to pay soldiers, bribe officials, or maintain the infrastructure that kept their empire running. Second, Dino would leak evidence of Silas's communications to every family on the eastern seaboard, proving that the Volkovs had orchestrated Catalina's death not as an act of war, but as a cowardly assassination of a civilian. In their world, there were rules, and killing an unarmed mother was a violation that would turn every alliance the Volkovs had into an enemy. Third, Carlo would call in favors with federal prosecutors, redirecting investigations that had been targeting other families toward the Volkovs instead. Not because Dino wanted them in prison, though that would be a consequence, but because federal attention meant every move they made would be scrutinized, every dollar tracked, every conversation potentially recorded. Fourth, Dino would offer amnesty and generous compensation to every soldier, accountant, and lawyer currently working for the Volkovs. He'd give them a way out, a clean exit, and in doing so, he'd hollow out the organization from the inside. An empire was only as strong as the people willing to die for it, and Dino was betting that most of the Volkovs, people were motivated by money, not loyalty. "You're going to make them irrelevant," Carlo said when Dino finished. "Not dead, not imprisoned, just irrelevant. They'll still be breathing, but they won't matter anymore. That's crueler than a bullet." "They killed my wife with a bullet," Dino said quietly. "They were planning to take my daughters. They deserve to watch everything they built turn to dust while they're powerless to stop it." "Catalina really did change you," Carlo said, and there was approval in his voice. "All right, you have my support. I'll make the calls. But Dino, I need you to understand something. The only reason I'm helping you is because you're choosing to be better than what this life usually makes of men. Don't make me regret believing you can actually pull that off." "I won't," Dino promised, and he meant it. By the time they pulled into the mansion's driveway, the rain had stopped, leaving everything clean and glistening. Dino saw his head of security standing on the front steps, and the man gave a small nod. Silas was contained, the mansion was secure, and the twins were safe. Mercy unbuckled her seatbelt but didn't move to open the door. "Why didn't you just kill them?" she asked. "The Volkovs, Silas, all of them. That's what someone in your position usually does, isn't it?" Dino turned off the engine and sat in the silence for a moment before answering. Because this all started with violence. The bullet that killed Catalina was meant to provoke a war that would destabilize the territory and let the Volkovs move in. If I respond with more violence, I'm just proving that their strategy works. But if I dismantle them without spilling blood, I'm proving that there's a different way to have power. For the twins, Mercy said, understanding. For the twins, Dino confirmed. I don't want them growing up in a world where the only way to solve problems is through fear and death. I want them to grow up knowing that their mother's heart is still beating, that love actually can be stronger than hate, and that the man who's supposed to protect them knows the difference between strength and cruelty. He looked at the mansion, at the home that had been a mausoleum for 18 months, and felt something shift in his chest. Catalina died because I built my life on violence. She died in a car out of gas, running an errand she shouldn't have had to run alone, caught in a war she never asked to be part of. If I keep living the same way, I'm disrespecting everything she sacrificed. Mercy reached across the console and took his hand. She gave me her heart so I could live, but I think she also gave it to me so I could bring it back to you and your daughters, so you could remember what it sounds like to love something more than you fear losing it. Dino squeezed her hand, then opened his door. Come on, there are 2 little girls in there who have been listening for you for 4 days straight. Let's not make them wait any longer. They walked toward the mansion together, and Dino realized that for the first time since Catalina's death, he was walking into his home instead of his fortress. The difference was subtle but seismic, and it had everything to do with the heartbeat he could almost hear echoing in the space between his own ribs. The heartbeat that had refused to die, even when everything else had tried to kill it. The heartbeat that was about to bring his family back to life. 6 months later, the mansion didn't sound like a museum anymore. It sounded like chaos and laughter, and the kind of beautiful noise that comes from a home where people are actually living instead of just existing. Dino sat on the Persian rug, the same $12,000 antique he'd once protected with museum-grade pads, and watched Mercy chase Luna and Arya in circles, all 3 of them wearing yellow rubber gloves inflated like balloons, shrieking with joy that rattled the chandeliers. Luna was walking now, not just walking, but running, her legs strong and sure, moving with a confidence that every specialist had said was impossible. She'd taken her first real steps 3 weeks after Mercy had come back, walking from Dino's arms to Mercy's without hesitation, and she hadn't stopped moving since. Arya was right behind her, always, the 2 of them inseparable in the way that only twins could be. "Hurricane incoming," Mercy shouted, and both girls screamed with delighted terror, diving behind the leather sofa that Dino had stopped worrying about the moment he'd realized furniture could be replaced, but moments couldn't. He'd changed everything about the house in the past 6 months. The security protocols were still in place, but they were invisible now, designed to protect without suffocating. The schedules had been thrown out entirely, replaced with something Mercy called responsive parenting, which apparently meant letting the twins eat when they were hungry, sleep when they were tired, and play until they collapsed from exhaustion. The staff had been reduced to just 3 people: a housekeeper who came twice a week, a chef who prepared meals but didn't live on site, and Frankie, who'd transitioned from head of security to something closer to a protective uncle. And Mercy, who'd moved into the mansion not as a nanny, but as something Dino didn't have words for yet. Something more than an employee, something different than a romantic partner, something that existed in the space between obligation and family and miracles. She caught him staring and smiled, that same bright expression that reminded him so much of Catalina it sometimes hurt to look at directly. "You're thinking too hard again," she said, plopping down on the rug beside him, slightly out of breath. "I can see the wheels turning from here." "I'm thinking about how different this is," Dino said, gesturing to the scene around them, toys scattered everywhere, the rug covered in the remnants of an elaborate tea party, the walls decorated with finger paintings that would have given his interior designer a heart attack. 6 months ago, I would have fired someone for leaving a single toy out of place. Now I can't remember the last time I saw the floor. "Is that a complaint?" Mercy asked, arching an eyebrow. "It's an observation, maybe a confession." He picked up one of the yellow gloves, turning it over in his hands. I spent 18 months trying to preserve Catalina's memory by keeping everything exactly as she left it. The house, the rules, the order. I thought if I could just maintain control over the environment, I could somehow keep her alive. But all I did was build a tomb. Luna climbed into his lap, her small hands immediately going to his face, patting his cheeks the way she did when she thought he was being too serious. "Dada sad?" she asked, her vocabulary expanding daily now that she had reasons to talk. "Not sad, baby girl, just thinking about Mama." "Mama here," Luna said with absolute certainty, pointing at Mercy. Then she pressed her hand to Mercy's chest, then her own, making the connection she'd understood long before any of the adults had. "Mama Heart, here." Dino felt his throat tighten. They'd decided, he and Mercy together, to tell the girls the truth when they were old enough to understand. Not yet, not at 2 years old, but someday. Someday they'd know that the woman who played with them and read them stories and kissed their scraped knees carried the literal heart of the mother who died protecting them. But even now, even without the words to explain it, they knew. They'd always known. "That's right," Mercy said softly, pulling Luna into an embrace that included Arya, who'd emerged from behind the sofa to join in. "Mama's heart is here, and it loves you so much." Dino watched them, this impossible family that had formed from tragedy and transplants, and the kind of love that refused to die even when the body that housed it stopped breathing. He'd dismantled most of his criminal empire in the past 6 months, liquidating assets, severing ties, transforming himself from a mafia kingpin into something closer to a legitimate businessman. It wasn't complete yet. You didn't just walk away from that life without consequences, but he was trying. For Catalina. For the girls. For Mercy, who'd never asked him to change but whose presence had made change inevitable. "I got the final paperwork today," he said, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "The adoption papers. If you sign them, you'll legally be their mother. Not a nanny, not a caregiver, their mother." Mercy's eyes went wide, then filled with tears. "Dino, I can't, I'm not trying to replace." "You're not replacing anyone," he interrupted. "You're continuing what Catalina started. She gave you her heart so you could live, Mercy. I think she knew somehow that you'd use that life to protect the daughters she couldn't raise. I think that was always the plan." "You believe in divine intervention now?" Mercy asked, laughing through her tears. "The ruthless mafia boss believes in fate." "I believe in evidence," Dino said. "And the evidence suggests that my wife's heart found its way into the chest of the one person on Earth who would love our daughters exactly the way they needed to be loved. Call it fate, call it coincidence, call it divine intervention. I don't care what the mechanism was. I only care that it brought you here." He held out the papers, and Mercy took them with shaking hands, scanning the legal language that would make official what had already been true for months. "What about you and me?" she asked quietly. "What are we?" "I don't know yet," Dino admitted. "But I think we have time to figure it out. No pressure, no expectations. Just 2 people raising 2 extraordinary children and trying to honor the woman who made it all possible." Mercy signed the papers with tears streaming down her face, and when she looked up, Luna and Arya were watching with those knowing eyes that saw too much and understood more than they should. "Mama," Arya said, testing the word. "Our mama." "Your mama," Mercy confirmed, pulling them both close. "Forever and always." The house filled with the sound of laughter again, as the girls demanded another round of the hurricane game. And Dino sat back and watched his family play on the rug, where Catalina's perfume still lingered in the fibers, mixed now with the scent of baby shampoo and the rubber of yellow gloves and the sweet smell of home. He'd learned what Catalina had tried to teach him before she died. That love wasn't about control or protection or keeping everything perfectly preserved in amber. Love was about letting go, about trusting that the people you cared about would find their way back to you even when logic said it was impossible. About believing that some bonds were stronger than death, deeper than blood, more powerful than any empire he could build. His wife had never truly left him. She just found a different way to stay. Dino finally learned that his wife never truly left him. Would you have been strong enough to admit that a common girl held the most precious thing you ever lost? Subscribe if you believe love is the greatest power in the world.